The phone rang 4 times before my mother picked up, and in the 4 seconds of silence after I told her I needed emergency surgery in 2 hours, I learned something about my family I'd spent 34 years refusing to see. My name is Claire. I'm 34 years old, a cardiology resident at Asheboro Regional Medical Center in North Carolina, and a single mother to 3-year-old twins, Ava and Owen. I was lying on a gurney in my own hospital's emergency department, and 4 already taped into the back of my hand, waiting for a trauma surgeon to come explain exactly how bad the internal bleeding was after a delivery truck ran a red light and hit my car broadside on Route 64. "Mom," I said, my voice thinner than I wanted it to be, the fluorescent lights overhead too bright, too white. "I need someone to watch the twins. I'm about to go into surgery. Can you and Dad come get them from daycare?" There was a pause. Not the pause of someone processing terrible news about their daughter's body being cut open in less than 2 hours. A different kind of pause, calculating, weighing, the pause of someone deciding how to phrase an inconvenience. "Claire, you know your father has his cardiology appointment this afternoon," my mother said. "And honestly, with everything going on right now, I just don't think we're in a place to take on the kids on top of everything." I lay there with the 4-line cold against my skin, the monitor beside me tracking a heart rate that I watched climb as she spoke, and felt something inside me go very quiet, not loud, not dramatic, just quiet, the way a room goes quiet right before something breaks. "I might die in surgery, Mom," I said. "I need you to take the twins." "Don't be so dramatic," she said. "You're a doctor. You know these things are routine. We just can't right now, Claire. You always make everything about you. I want you to understand something before I tell you what happened over the next several months, because it matters. I had been paying portions of my parents' mortgage, their medical bills, my father's heart medication, and assorted emergencies for 8 years by the time I made that phone call. 8 years of wire transfers and Venmo requests and quiet sacrifices I never mentioned to anyone, because somewhere along the way, I had convinced myself that this was simply what a good daughter did. That love, in my family, was something you earned through usefulness. That if I just gave enough, eventually, somehow, I would become worth showing up for. I hung up the phone in that emergency bay with my hands shaking, called my Aunt Margaret instead, and she had my twins from daycare within 40 minutes, sitting beside my hospital bed by the time I came out of recovery 7 hours later, stroking my hair the way my own mother hadn't done since I was a child small enough to need it. I didn't know it yet, lying in that recovery room with my body stitched back together and my chest hollowed out by something that had nothing to do with the surgery, but that phone call was the beginning of the end of 8 years of silence. And what I would learn over the following months, about my parents, about my sister, about exactly how long this had been happening and how deliberately it had been hidden from the rest of our family, would change every single thing I believed about where I came from. To understand how I got to that gurney, you have to understand the shape of my family long before any of this, the particular architecture of favoritism that had organized our household since I was old enough to notice it. My older sister, Brooke, was the golden child in every sense people use that phrase. She was beautiful in the effortless way that made people stop on the street, charming in a way that made even strangers want to do things for her, and from as far back as I can remember, my parents' attention bent toward her the way a plant bends toward light, automatically, without conscious decision, simply because that's where the warmth was. I was the responsible one. The reliable one. The one who got good grades without anyone needing to check on me, who worked through college on scholarships and loans because my parents' limited resources had already been allocated toward Brooke's tuition at a private university, her wedding, her down payment on a house in a neighborhood our parents bragged about to their friends. I told myself, for years, that this was simply how families worked, that different children received different kinds of support based on different needs, and that my self-sufficiency was something to be proud of rather than evidence of something I wasn't yet ready to examine. My father, Gerald, had a heart condition that worsened steadily through my 20s, nothing immediately life-threatening, but serious enough to require ongoing medication and periodic procedures that strained my parents' already precarious finances. My mother, Diane, managed the household's appearance of stability with a kind of relentless, image-conscious determination. She cared, deeply and visibly, about how the family looked from the outside, less visibly about how any of us felt on the inside. When I started my medical residency at 26, earning my first real income after years of loans and scraping by, my parents came to me, not Brooke, who was already established with her husband in their comfortable suburban life, and explained that they were struggling. The mortgage. My father's medications. A car repair that couldn't wait. I said yes. Of course I said yes. I had spent my entire childhood watching my parents pour resources and attention toward Brooke, and some quiet, hungry part of me believed, with the kind of conviction you don't examine because examining it would hurt too much, that if I could just be useful enough, generous enough, indispensable enough, I would finally earn the kind of love I'd watched flow so easily toward my sister. That belief would cost me 8 years and nearly everything I had. For most of those 8 years, the arrangement felt, if not entirely fair, at least manageable. I'd transfer money monthly, sometimes $300, sometimes closer to $1,000 depending on what crisis had emerged, and my parents would thank me briefly, almost perfunctorily, before the conversation moved on to other things. Usually, those other things involved Brooke. I don't think I fully registered, in those early years, how completely the financial relationship had become one-directional, how thoroughly my contributions had simply been absorbed into the household's expectations without acknowledgement or reciprocity. I was working brutal residency hours, raising newborn twins largely alone after their father left before they turned 1, and somewhere in the exhaustion of those years, I stopped tracking the imbalance with any real clarity. There was a Sunday dinner, about 3 years into the financial arrangement, when my mother mentioned, almost in passing, that Brooke and her husband were considering a kitchen renovation. Of course, that's a big expense, she said, glancing toward me in a way I registered but didn't fully process at the time. I remember the small, automatic calculation that ran through my mind, wondering if this was leading toward a request, and feeling, underneath that calculation, a flicker of something uncomfortable that I pushed away before it could fully surface. I didn't ask my mother directly what she meant. I told myself I was being paranoid, reading implications into an innocent comment about my sister's home improvements. The twins arrived 18 months later, and the arrangement with my parents continued largely unchanged, even as my own financial pressures multiplied, daycare costs, a mortgage of my own, the particular expensive chaos of raising 2 children essentially alone while working 80-hour weeks. I kept sending money. I told myself this was simply what family did for each other, that eventually, surely, this generosity would be recognized, reciprocated, valued. It was around this time that I started noticing something in my father's behavior I couldn't fully name, a kind of evasiveness that surfaced specifically around conversations involving money. When I'd ask, gently, how the mortgage payments were going, whether my contributions were actually covering what they needed, he'd give vague, slightly too quick answers and change the subject within a sentence or two. I noted this. I didn't push it. I told myself my father had always been somewhat private about finances, that this was simply his temperament rather than anything requiring deeper examination. I see now, looking back, that this was the first behavioral sign I dismissed too easily, the quickness of his deflection, the way his eyes would shift toward the window or the television whenever the subject of where exactly my money was going came up. At the time, I read it as discomfort about needing help at all, a wounded pride I wanted to be gentle with rather than press against. Grandpa Walter, my mother's father, had always been the one steady presence in my extended family, a retired contractor with a dry sense of humor and an unshakable sense of fairness that occasionally put him at odds with my mother's favoritism toward Brooke. He lived alone in a small house 20 minutes from mine, and I'd taken to bringing the twins to see him most Saturday mornings, partly for them, partly, I think now, because something in his steady presence felt like the parental warmth I wasn't getting elsewhere. It was during one of these visits, about 4 years into the financial arrangement with my parents, that Grandpa Walter said something that lodged itself in my chest and stayed there. We were sitting on his back porch while the twins chased each other around his small yard, and he said, apropos of nothing, "You know your mother and father aren't hurting for money the way they let on, don't you?" I felt something tighten in my stomach. What do you mean? He was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing how much to say. I don't want to cause trouble in the family, Claire. But I've seen things over the years that don't add up with how desperate they make it sound to you. New furniture. A vacation to the coast last spring that nobody mentioned to you, I'd bet. I just think you should keep your eyes open, is all. I didn't ask him to elaborate further that day. I told myself Grandpa Walter simply didn't have the full picture, that he was seeing isolated purchases without understanding the broader financial strain my parents were genuinely under. I drove home with the twins asleep in their car seats and told myself, with more conviction than I actually felt, that I was being a good daughter, that this was simply what supporting family looked like. That conviction would take 3 more years and 1 car accident to finally crack. The unease that Grandpa Walter's comment had planted didn't disappear, even though I didn't act on it directly. It surfaced instead in smaller observations I began, almost involuntarily, to track. I noticed, over the following year, that my mother's Facebook posts, which I scrolled through occasionally, the way you check on family from a careful distance, showed a life that didn't entirely match the financial precarity she described to me directly. A new handbag in one photo. A weekend trip to Charleston that nobody had mentioned needing my help to fund. I told myself there could be explanations, gifts from friends, sales, money set aside specifically for small indulgences while the larger financial picture remained genuinely strained. I want to be honest about something here. I had the option, at multiple points during this year, to simply ask my parents directly for a full accounting of where my contributions were actually going. I didn't take that option. Some part of me understood that asking directly would force a reckoning I wasn't ready for, that if I confirmed what Grandpa Walter had implied, I would have to face the possibility that 8 years of sacrifice had been, at least partially, exploited rather than genuinely needed. So instead, I kept giving, and kept noticing small inconsistencies I didn't fully investigate. There was a phone call, about 6 months before my accident, when my father called asking for an additional $400 for what he described as an urgent car repair. I sent it, the way I always did. 2 weeks later, at a family barbecue, Brooke mentioned, casually, that she and her husband had just bought my father a nice little upgrade on his old sedan as an early birthday gift, new tires, a detail job, nothing that sounded like the urgent $400 emergency he described to me. I felt something cold move through my chest at that detail, standing in my parents' backyard with a paper plate of barbecue going untouched in my hand. I looked at my father, and he must have seen something in my face, because he glanced away quickly, his hand moving to rub the back of his neck in a gesture I'd later recognize as one he made specifically when he was caught in a half-truth. I didn't say anything that day. I told myself there was probably a reasonable explanation. Maybe the urgent repair had been something separate from what Brooke was describing. Maybe I was connecting 2 unrelated events into a pattern that didn't actually exist. That night, lying awake long after the twins had gone to sleep, I felt my appetite from earlier completely gone, replaced by a tight, persistent unease that sat in my stomach like something I'd swallowed wrong. I didn't sleep well. I kept turning the barbecue moment over, examining it from different angles, trying to find the explanation that would let me keep believing what I needed to believe. I didn't find one. I just got better, over the following weeks, at not looking too closely. It was around this time that Brooke herself began behaving in ways that struck me as subtly different, not dramatically, but in a register I'd learned to read carefully over 34 years of being her younger sister. She started asking me, with unusual frequency, how my arrangement with our parents was going, framing the questions with a casualness that felt, increasingly, performed rather than genuine. "You're so generous, Claire," she said once, during one of these conversations, in a tone I couldn't quite place, admiring on the surface, but with something underneath it I didn't have language for yet. "I don't know how you manage it, with the twins and your schedule and everything." I took this, at the time, as simple acknowledgement, maybe even gratitude, however indirect. It would be months before I understood that Brooke had known, far more precisely than I did, exactly how my contributions were being used, and had been actively managing my understanding of the situation to ensure I kept giving without asking too many direct questions. There was a near admission I almost caught, about 4 months before my accident, during a phone call with Brooke that started normally enough, catching up about the twins, her own daughter's preschool, and then shifted, briefly, into something else. She'd mentioned, almost without meaning to, honestly, Mom and Dad would be in real trouble without what you send them every month, especially with, and then stopped herself abruptly, the sentence trailing into silence. "Especially with what?" I asked. "Nothing," she said, too quickly. "Just, everything going on. Dad's heart stuff. The usual." I let it go. I told myself, again, that I was reading too much into incomplete sentences, that everyone trails off mid-thought sometimes without it meaning anything significant. I didn't know it then, but Brooke had nearly told me, in that moment, something she'd been carrying for years, a piece of knowledge about exactly how our parents had been using my contributions that went well beyond simple financial need. She told me, much later, what had actually been happening in her mind during that call. I almost told you everything right then. I'd gotten so used to managing what you knew and didn't know that the sentence just slipped out before I could stop it, especially with, "What, Claire?" you'd have asked, and I would have had to either lie outright or finally tell you that Mom and Dad had been using a good portion of what you sent toward things that had nothing to do with emergencies. I caught myself just in time. I told myself I was protecting you from unnecessary family conflict, that knowing wouldn't change anything except make you angry and make the holidays harder for everyone. The truth is I liked the arrangement exactly as it was. Your money meant our parents needed less from me, freed up resources for things I wanted without ever having to ask for them directly. I told myself silence was kindness. I think now it was simply convenient. I didn't know any of that in the moment. I just knew that something in the conversation had left an uncomfortable residue I couldn't fully name, and that, once again, I'd chosen not to examine it directly. The accident happened on a Tuesday afternoon in early October, 8 months after that unfinished phone call with Brooke, and the weeks following my surgery and recovery were the hardest of my adult life, not primarily because of the physical healing, though that was difficult enough, but because of what the accident had finally forced into clear view. I came home from the hospital 5 days after surgery to find Aunt Margaret had organized everything: meals, the twin schedules, a rotation of help from her own friends and Grandpa Walter. My parents called twice during that first week, brief, slightly awkward calls that focused mostly on logistics rather than my actual well-being. Neither of them visited in person. I lay in my own bed during my recovery, unable to sleep properly because of the pain medication's strange effects on my dreams, and found myself, for the first time in 8 years, actually doing the math I'd been avoiding. I pulled up my banking records on my laptop, propped carefully against pillows because sitting up straight still hurt, and started tracking, methodically, exactly how much I'd sent my parents over the previous 8 years. The number, when I finally totaled it, stopped my breath: just under $91,000, sent in increments small enough that I'd never sat with the full weight of the total at once. I sat with that number for a long time, the laptop screen glowing in my otherwise dark bedroom, and felt something shift permanently in my understanding of my own family. I want to be honest about something here, because it matters. Even with that number staring back at me, I still hesitated to act. I told myself I needed more concrete information before drawing conclusions, that a large total didn't necessarily mean malicious misuse, that my parents' genuine financial struggles could account for most or all of it even if some portion had gone toward things I hadn't explicitly authorized. So instead of confronting them directly, I did something I'd never done before. I called my cousin Hannah, Aunt Margaret's daughter, who worked in accounting and had always had a clearer, less emotionally entangled view of our extended family's dynamics. Hannah was quiet for a long moment after I explained what I'd found. "Claire," she finally said, "I probably should have said something sooner, but I didn't think it was my place. My mom, your Aunt Margaret, has mentioned a few things over the years. Your parents took a Caribbean cruise 2 years ago that they told everyone was a work conference for your dad. Brooke's kitchen renovation last year was substantially funded by a loan from your parents that, as far as I know, was never expected to be paid back. I don't know the exact numbers, but I know it's been more pattern than coincidence." I sat with the phone against my ear, my chest tight in a way that had nothing to do with my still healing surgical incision, and felt the floor of my understanding shift completely. I spent the following 2 weeks, still technically on medical leave, quietly gathering what additional information I could: bank statements, old text messages I'd never fully reread, conversations with Hannah and Aunt Margaret who, once they understood I was finally ready to see the full picture, became increasingly forthcoming about details they'd previously kept vague out of a desire not to interfere. The pattern that emerged was clear and, once I let myself see it fully, undeniable. My parents had been using a significant portion of my contributions, not for the emergencies and necessities they described to me, but for vacations, home upgrades, and substantial financial support to Brooke that had never been disclosed to me as the actual purpose of my emergency transfers. There was a moment, during this period of gathering proof, when I found old text messages between my mother and Brooke that Brooke had apparently forwarded to me by accident years earlier, then never followed up on when I hadn't responded, buried in a folder I rarely checked. In them, my mother discussed, with Brooke, how to phrase the next request to me, what kind of a crisis framing would be most likely to get a quick response without prompting too many follow-up questions. I read those messages 3 times, sitting at my kitchen table with the twins napping upstairs, and felt something in my chest that wasn't quite anger yet, something closer to a profound, disorienting grief for 8 years I could never get back. I had proof now. What I still needed was the strength to use it. That came 2 weeks later, at Grandpa Walter's 80th birthday party, in front of nearly the entire extended family, though not because I'd planned the confrontation to happen there. Grandpa Walter planned it that way himself. Grandpa Walter's 80th birthday was held in the backyard of his house, the same yard where the twins had played years earlier while he first warned me, gently, that something wasn't adding up. Nearly 30 family members had gathered, my parents, Brooke and her husband, Aunt Margaret, Uncle Ray, cousins Hannah and Tyler, and a scattering of family friends who'd known Grandpa Walter for decades. I hadn't told anyone, not even Aunt Margaret, exactly what I'd discovered in the weeks since my accident. I'd planned to bring this directly to my parents privately, in my own time, on my own terms. I never got that chance, because Grandpa Walter, it turned out, had been doing his own quiet investigating in parallel with mine, calling around to family members, asking careful questions, piecing together a version of the same picture I'd assembled from his own angle. After the cake had been cut and the gifts opened, Grandpa Walter stood at the head of the patio table, a folder in his weathered hands that I hadn't noticed him carrying earlier, and cleared his throat in a way that drew the yard's attention. "I want to say something before this party winds down," he said, his voice steady despite the slight tremor that had crept into it over the past few years. "I've lived 80 years, and I've learned that silence in a family usually protects the wrong people. I love my daughter." He looked at my mother. "And I love my granddaughters, both of them. But I can't sit at my own birthday party and watch one of them carry a burden the rest of us have let her carry alone for 8 years." The yard went quiet in the particular way gatherings go quiet when something unplanned and serious has entered the room. My mother's face had gone pale, her hand finding my father's arm in a grip I could see tighten from across the patio. "Dad," she said, "now isn't the time." "It's exactly the time," Grandpa Walter said, opening the folder. "Claire has been sending you money every month for 8 years. Emergency money, money for medical bills, money for the mortgage. $91,000, near as we can figure. And I have it on good authority, from more than one person in this family, that a fair amount of that went toward a cruise, a kitchen renovation for Brooke, and other things that weren't emergencies at all." I stood frozen near the dessert table, my heart pounding in a way that reminded me uncomfortably of the monitors I'd been hooked to in that recovery room months earlier. I hadn't authorized this. I hadn't planned for this. But watching my parents' faces in that moment, my mother's careful composure cracking visibly, my father's eyes darting toward the gate as if calculating an exit, I understood that whatever was about to happen had been building toward this moment for far longer than the 8 years I'd been tracking. "This is absurd," my mother said, her voice rising, gathering the particular brittle outrage I recognized from childhood arguments she'd always won by sheer volume. "Claire offered to help. We never forced her into anything. If she's been keeping some kind of resentful tally this whole time instead of just talking to us like an adult, that's on her, not on us." "I tried to talk to you," I said, finding my voice, surprised by how steady it came out. "I asked, more than once, where the money was actually going. You always changed the subject. Because you make everything so complicated," my mother snapped. "We're your parents, Claire. We don't owe you a line-item accounting every time we need help." Brooke, standing near her husband, had gone very still, her face carefully arranged into something between confusion and concern that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I don't know what any of this has to do with me," she said. "If Mom and Dad needed help with my kitchen, that's between them and Claire. I didn't ask for any of this." I looked at her, and something in my expression must have communicated more than words could have, because I watched a flicker of genuine discomfort cross her face before she recovered her composure. "I have the text messages, Brooke," I said quietly. The ones where you and Mom discussed how to phrase the next request to me so I wouldn't ask follow-up questions. I found them 2 weeks ago. The silence that followed was different from before, heavier, more exposed. Around the patio, I could see family members exchanging glances, the social architecture of the gathering visibly shifting as people began, quietly, to recalculate their understanding of who in this family had been telling the truth. My father, who had said almost nothing throughout this entire exchange, finally spoke, his voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. "Claire, sweetheart, we never meant for it to feel like this." "I almost died," I said, and for the first time, my voice cracked slightly, the calm precision I'd been holding on to finally showing its first real fracture. "I called you from a hospital bed asking you to take care of my children while I went into surgery, and you told me I was being dramatic. I need you to understand that. Whatever else has happened with the money, that's the part one can't get past." My mother opened her mouth to respond, to deflect, to minimize, to redirect the conversation the way she always had, and I watched her gather herself for exactly that kind of response. But something in the gathered silence of the family around us, in Grandpa Walter's steady, unflinching presence beside her, seemed to take the air out of whatever she'd been about to say. "I need to go home," I finally said, into the heavy quiet. "I'm not going to do this here, in front of everyone, the way you've apparently been comfortable doing everything else behind my back for years." I gathered the twins, who'd been playing obliviously near the swing set throughout most of this, and left Grandpa Walter's birthday party with my hands shaking on the steering wheel the entire drive home, the adrenaline of the confrontation giving way, somewhere around the 3rd mile, to a wave of grief so complete I had to pull into a gas station parking lot to let it move through me before I trusted myself to keep driving. In the weeks following Grandpa Walter's birthday party, I did something I'd never done in 8 years. I stopped sending money. Completely, immediately, without negotiation. My mother called repeatedly during the first 2 weeks, leaving voicemails that shifted in tone from outrage to wounded to, eventually, something that sounded almost like genuine bewilderment, as if she truly couldn't understand how the arrangement she'd built had finally collapsed. I let most of those calls go to voicemail. I wasn't ready, yet, to have the conversation she seemed to want, one where I simply forgot what had happened and resumed the previous pattern. It was Brooke who finally broke through, calling one evening about 3 weeks after the party, her voice different than I'd heard it in years, smaller, less performed. "Can we talk?" she said, "actually talk, not the version where I pretend I don't know things I know?" I agreed, cautiously, and she came over the following weekend, sitting across from me at my kitchen table while the twins napped upstairs, and finally told me what she'd been carrying. "I need to tell you the whole thing," she said. "Not the version I gave everyone at Grandpa's party. The truth, even the parts that make me look as bad as I actually was. It started small, the way these things do. Mom and Dad mentioned, years ago, that you'd offered to help with some bills, and somewhere in that conversation, I realized it took pressure off all of us, off them needing to ask me for anything, off me needing to offer. I told myself, at the time, that this wasn't really my business, that whatever arrangement you and our parents had worked out privately wasn't something I needed to interfere with. But then the kitchen renovation came up, and Mom suggested, almost casually, that some of what you were sending could cover part of it, framed it to me as something you'd be happy to help with if you understood how much it would mean to the family. I told myself that made it okay. I told myself you'd probably say yes anyway if asked directly, so the framing didn't really matter. The truth is, I knew, somewhere underneath all that justification, that you weren't being given the full picture. Every time the subject came close to surfacing honestly, I found a way to smooth it over, to keep things vague enough that you wouldn't ask the questions that would have unraveled everything. I told myself I was protecting family harmony. I think now I was protecting a situation that benefited me directly, and I didn't want to examine that too closely because I liked what it gave me: a kitchen, a vacation Mom and Dad covered using your money, a general sense that someone else was handling the family's financial stress so I didn't have to. The moment on the phone, months before your accident, when I almost told you everything, I've thought about that moment more than almost anything else since your party. I had the truth right there, in my mouth, and I swallowed it back down because telling you would have meant giving something up. I'm not proud of that. I don't expect you to forgive it quickly, or maybe at all. I just needed you to hear the actual shape of it from me, instead of piecing it together entirely on your own. I sat with what Brooke had said for a long moment, the kitchen quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator, feeling something in my chest that wasn't quite forgiveness but wasn't pure anger either, something more complicated, still settling into its final shape. "I believe you're telling me the truth now," I finally said. "I need time before I know what that means for us going forward. I'm not interested in performing reconciliation for the rest of the family's comfort. If we rebuild something, it has to be real." My parents, for their part, never offered the kind of full accounting Brooke eventually gave me. My mother's voicemails continued, intermittently, over the following months, oscillating between attempts at reconciliation and occasional flashes of the old outrage whenever she felt I wasn't responding quickly enough to her terms. My father remained largely silent, communicating mostly through brief, awkward texts that never quite addressed what had actually happened. I didn't expect more from them, by that point. I had spent 8 years hoping that enough generosity would eventually produce the kind of unconditional love I'd watched flow so easily toward Brooke. What I learned, finally, standing in Grandpa Walter's backyard and in the months that followed, is that love built on usefulness isn't love at all, it's a transaction, and transactions can be ended. I maintained my boundaries. I stopped the financial support permanently. I remained open, cautiously, to genuine accountability from my parents if it ever came, but I stopped waiting for it, stopped organizing my own peace around whether or when they might finally offer it. Dr. Nathan Cole, a colleague from the cardiology department who'd quietly checked in on me throughout my recovery and the months that followed, became, slowly and without either of us rushing it, something steadier in my life than I'd expected to find during this particular chapter. Not a rescue, not a replacement for what my family had failed to give me, but evidence, simply, that the kind of consistent care I'd been manufacturing through money for 8 years was actually available, freely, from people who didn't require it. I am still a mother to Ava and Owen, still working impossible hours in a specialty I love, still navigating a complicated relationship with my parents and a slowly rebuilding one with my sister. But I am not the woman who believed love had to be earned through sacrifice anymore. I'm something else now, someone who finally understands the difference between generosity and self-erasure, and who chose, deliberately, after 8 years, to stop confusing the two. There's a particular kind of red flag that's easy to miss because it's wrapped in family obligation instead of obvious cruelty. My parents' requests never looked like exploitation from the inside, they looked like need, like a daughter simply being asked to help the people who raised her. I understand now why I missed it for so long. Examining it directly would have meant confronting the much larger, much more painful question of why that help was never reciprocated with the kind of attention and care I quietly hoped it would earn. Looking back, my father's quick deflections about where the money was actually going weren't simply privacy about finances, they were the first sign of something I wasn't ready to name yet. I had pieces of this pattern for years before I let myself see the whole shape of it, and I understand now that I wasn't blind to those pieces so much as unwilling to let them cost me the family I needed to believe I had. The real turning point wasn't the accident itself, though it was the catalyst. It was the moment, lying in that hospital bed, when my mother's hesitation became impossible to reframe as anything other than what it actually was. I had spent 8 years building an elaborate story that explained away every inconsistency, every quick deflection, every unexplained vacation. The accident simply removed my ability to keep telling that story to myself. What I learned, in the end, wasn't really about the money, though the $91,000 matters, and I won't pretend it doesn't. It was about the cost of believing that love can be purchased through endless usefulness, how completely you can lose track of your own worth when you've spent years measuring it only by what you provide to other people, and how much courage it actually takes to stop, even when stopping means admitting how long you let yourself be used. If there's one thing I'd want anyone listening to this to take with them, it's this: notice when helping family has stopped being a choice and started being an expectation nobody bothers to question or thank you for. Notice the quick deflections, the vague explanations, the subtle redirections away from honest accounting. You don't have to wait for a hospital bed and an 80-year-old man's birthday party to finally ask the questions you've been avoiding. I hope you don't have to. But if some part of this story sounded familiar, if some part of you recognized yourself in the daughter who kept giving because some part of her still hoped it would finally be enough, let this be the moment you start asking anyway. I'm not angry anymore, most days. I'm something steadier than that now. Something that finally feels, after 8 years, entirely my own.